Hi, this is a presentation called On the Road, Women and Travel. And I'm going to start it off by reading two excerpts from On the Road. First one goes like this. In the morning, while we sat around dumbly smoking butts from ashtrays in the gray light of a gloomy day, Dean got up nervously, paced around, thinking, and decided the thing to do was to have Mary Lou make breakfast and sweep the floor. That's the first excerpt. It comes from one of the first couple of pages of the book. Second excerpt is on page 113 of your edition, and it goes like this. My aunt once said the world would never find peace until men fell at their women's feet and asked for forgiveness. But Dean knew this. He'd mentioned it many times. I've pleaded and pleaded with Mary Lou for a peaceful, sweet understanding of pure love between us forever with all hassles thrown out. She understands. Her mind is bent on something else. She's after me. She won't understand how much I love her. She's knitting my doom. The truth of the matter is we don't understand our women. We blame on them, and it's all our fault, I said. But it isn't as simple as that, warned Dean. Peace will come suddenly. We won't understand when it does. See, man? So you might get a sense of why I'm beginning with those two quotes to talk about On the Road, because I'm going to ask you to think about the relationship between the women in the book and the male characters and travel. I first read On the Road when I was 16, and I loved it. I loved the unconventional, unrestrained lifestyle of Sal and Dean and all their friends. I had grown up in Delaware all my life. I hadn't really traveled that much myself, and I couldn't wait to get on the road, see America, couldn't wait to roar down the highway in a car with a notebook full of poems and a few close friends. That sounded like the American dream to me. After age 16, I graduated high school, went off to college, started studying literature, and then several years later, around 20 or 21, I reread On the Road, and I noticed something that I hadn't really noticed the first time. The women in the book were treated differently from the men, and for the most part, the women weren't really part of the road trips. Sure, Mary Lou joins Dean on a couple of his road trips, but for the most part, it's about the men getting out on the road while the women stay at home. I can make lots and lots of observations at this point. I'm going to leave them to you to make on your discussion board posts. Instead, I'm going to give you a little bit of historical context about women and travel in the 1950s to get you started thinking along this subject. In 1963, a woman named Betty Friedan published a book called The Feminine Mystique, and it's famous today. And it was based on a survey she gave to her fellow Smith College alums in 1957. Betty Friedan found that in spite of everyone's seeming happiness, because the women that she asked tended to be happily married, they had children, they had nice homes in the suburbs, they had their days filled with activities, these intelligent women felt that something was seriously lacking in their own lives, something they could sense but could not name. And that's where the title The Feminine Mystique comes from, this deep dissatisfaction that doesn't have a name. Betty Friedan also found that in 1959, Smith seniors, like her own fellow seniors in the class of 1942, had no sense of what they wanted to be beyond the age of 21. She remembers, quote, I felt the future closing in, and I could not see myself in it at all. I had no image of myself stretching beyond college. I had come at 17 from a Midwestern town, an unsure girl. The wide horizons of the world and the life of the mind had been opened to me. I had begun to know who I was and what I wanted to do. I could not go back now. I could not go home again to the life of my mother and the women of our town, bound to home, bridge, shopping, children, husband, charity, clothes. But now that the time had come to make my own future, to take the deciding step, I suddenly did not know what I wanted to be. Betty Friedan's not talking sort of explicitly about travel, but at the same time, the fact that the women in the 1950s that she polled did not seem to have a map of who they were and where they were going seems significant in the context of a class about travel and the way that people travel. Travel theory acknowledges that historically women have nearly always traveled through the world differently than men have. Consider the Odyssey by Homer, which our friend Van den Ebele names the archetypal journey. Odysseus, the man, is returning home from the Trojan War, and he visits all sorts of different islands and has a wide range of adventures. Penelope, his faithful wife, has remained home in Ithaca for nearly 20 years, waiting for him, keeping other suitors at bay, weaving and then unraveling her tapestry every day. Circe and Calypso are powerful female figures in the Odyssey, yet they too must remain on their respective islands. They can hold Odysseus captive for a time, but then he must be on his way again. By the time Kerouac writes On the Road, civilization has advanced thousands of years, but how much has really changed in this respect? In The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan also writes, quote, "Changeless woman, childish woman, a woman's place is in the home, they were told. But man was changing. His place was in the world, and the world was widening. Woman was being left behind. Women also had minds. They also had the human need to grow. But the work that fed and moved it forward was no longer done at home, and women were not trained to understand work and work in the world. Confined to the home, a child among her children, passive, no part of her existence under her control, a woman could only exist by pleasing man. She was wholly dependent on his protection in a world that she had no share in making, man's world. She could never grow up to ask the simple human question, who am I? What do I want?" Unquote. Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, again published in 1963, helped to kick off the second wave of feminism in the United States, and a lot has changed since its publication. My intention in bringing it to your attention is, firstly, to provide a historical context for On the Road, and secondly, to invite you to consider the role of gender in terms of travel. If you look at the syllabus for this class, nearly all of the works are by men. The only exception is in the last module, where Joan Didion is acting as a reporter and reporting on the waves of young people who have traveled to San Francisco in 1967. There are certainly travel narratives written by women over the centuries, and many of them are excellent, but the bulk of travel writing has historically been done by men. This unit will ask you to consider the women in On the Road. They're all minor characters, but minor characters can often yield major insights into the main characters, the author's perspectives, and the story's themes. They're also far from homogeneous, even if they're on the sidelines. There's a major difference between Camille, and you'll read an excerpt from her real-life counterpart's memoir, Off the Road, Mary Lou, Galatea Dunkel, and Jane Lee. In real life, Jane Lee was a beautiful and brilliant young woman named Joan Vollmer, who tragically descended into drug addiction after she met Kerouac and the other Beats. She died young in a horrible accident. Joan and William S. Burroughs, the real-life bully, played William Tell with a gun, and Burroughs missed. In considering the women in On the Road, this unit also requires that you consider the men and the ways that masculinity is established and defined in On the Road. As much as this is a story about travel, it's also a story about male friendship, most especially the friendship between Sal and Dean. So take some time to analyze how those bonds are established. I look forward to reading your posts on the discussion board. Please let me know if you have any questions.